Have you ever had that experience where you go to the doctor and you're just expecting a really simple answer?
Oh, yeah. Like you want them to just look at a chart and say, here's the problem.
Right, like you twist your ankle, it swells up like a balloon, and you go in for an x-ray. The doctor throws the image up on the screen, points to a very clear, jagged white line across the bone, and just says, there it is. Broken.
It's incredibly satisfying in a weird way because it's binary. It's visible. You just have a definitive answer.
Exactly. It's broken or it's not. But then, I mean, think about what happens when you step into a totally different wing of the hospital. Say you're dealing with something cystic, like an autoimmune issue or a complex neurological condition.
Oh, sure. In that case, the X-ray machine is pretty much completely useless.
Right. You're trying to track a ghost in the machine. Symptoms pop up in one area and then they disappear, or they migrate somewhere else entirely.
The whole diagnostic landscape just becomes incredibly murky.
Exactly. You aren't looking for a single break anymore. You're looking for patterns across an entire system.
Which requires an entirely different set of diagnostic tools, really. I mean, you have to map the whole ecosystem, not just take a snapshot of a single bone.
Yeah, and I want you to keep that image of the murky, complex diagnostic process in your mind, because it is the perfect way to frame what we are doing today. If you are joining us for this deep dive, we are taking you on a rigorously intellectual mapping expedition.
But instead of the human body, we're looking at the global political body.
Right. We are tracking the rise, the development, and, in a lot of cases, the catastrophic breakdown of democracy and dictatorship in the post-communist world.
Which is a massive undertaking.
It is. We're looking at a huge stack of research, data, and historical analysis, pulling heavily from the work compiled by Valerie Bunce, Michael McFaul, and Catherine Stoner-Weiss, covering 11 different nations across 3 major waves of political upheaval.
And just to orient you to the timeline we're analyzing today, those 3 waves are distinct, but they're deeply interconnected.
Yeah, lay those out for us.
So the first is that massive rapid regime collapse from roughly 1989 to 1992, basically the era of the Berlin Wall coming down.
Right, the really famous one.
Exactly. Then the second wave is driven by the gravitational pull of the European Union, and that runs roughly from the late 1990s through 2007.
Okay.
And the third is this really fascinating, highly strategic wave from 1996 to 2005. That one is characterized by citizens actively engineering the electoral defeats of entrenched dictators. We're talking places like Serbia, Georgia, and Ukraine.
And our mission today isn't just to, give you a historical timeline. We're not going to read you a table of contents or just list off who won what election in 1998.
Yeah, that's what Wikipedia is for.
Right, exactly. We want to construct a comprehensive intellectual map of how and why regimes actually transition. We're going to pull apart the actual ground-level mechanics of how a revolution becomes contagious.
Which is such a wild concept when you really dig into it.
It really is. How does the idea to overthrow a government literally jump across a sovereign border? And crucially, because let's face it, this isn't a fairy tale where democracy always wins, we are going to examine how modern autocrats learn, adapt, and strike back with just terrifying efficiency.
And the post-communist region offers something uniquely valuable for this kind of analysis. It provides a sheer density of data.
I look at it as the ultimate political laboratory for the modern world. I mean, think about it. You have this massive geographic and cultural space that for decades was locked under a single rigid system.
And then, almost overnight, the freezer gets unplugged.
Everything thaws at once. The forces of democracy and authoritarianism are suddenly subjected to extreme stress tests.
Every single variable, economics, media, military loyalty, it's all pushed to the absolute breaking point.
Right. But to understand the results coming out of that laboratory, we first have to talk about the flawed scientific models that researchers originally brought into the lab with them.
Oh, absolutely. That is the essential starting point for this whole map. To understand why the post-communist world developed the way it did, you really have to understand the intellectual paradigms that preceded it.
And why those paradigms completely collapsed when they hit the reality of 1989.
Yes. Specifically, the data requires us to look at what political science calls the third wave model of democratization.
Let's set the stage for that. The third wave refers to the democratic transitions that took place in Latin America and Southern Europe.
So places like Portugal, Spain, Brazil, Argentina.
Right, mostly in the 1970s and 1980s. And the analysts and observers who watched those transitions, they built a very specific, almost rigid model of how a country is, quote unquote, supposed to move from a dictatorship to a democracy.
And the absolute cornerstone of that third wave model was the concept of the elite pact.
The pact.
Yeah. The foundational theory was that successful democratic transitions are inherently conservative.
Yeah.
They are not radical. They're negotiated, elite-driven affairs happening, behind closed doors.
Picture a smoke-filled room where the fate of millions is being decided over scotch and cigars.
In many ways, yeah, that's exactly it. The model relies on a very specific balance of power. On one side, you have softliners within the authoritarian regime.
So, like technocrats or moderate generals who realize the dictatorship is just running out of steam.
Exactly. And on the other side, you have moderates within the democratic opposition, and they realize they don't have the firepower to just storm the presidential palace.
So they reach a profound stalemate.
Right. Neither side can completely crush the other without dragging the entire country into a devastating civil war.
So out of a mutual sense of self-preservation, they compromise.
They do. And the analytical term for this is democracy without Democrats.
I've always thought that's a brilliant phrase. It perfectly captures the cynicism of the moment.
It really does. These elites aren't agreeing to hold free elections and establish a parliament because they suddenly had a moral awakening and, read Thomas Jefferson.
Right, they're not idealists.
No, they agreed to new democratic rules as a second-best option. It's a mechanism to protect their own wealth, their own lives, and their own institutional power.
And for these pacts to hold together, the research from that era insisted on some very strict rules. First, the transition had to be slow, evolutionary, not revolutionary.
Yeah.
And second, and this is massive, mass mobilization was viewed as a mortal threat.
Oh, totally. Citizens taking to the streets, demanding justice or demanding the heads of the generals. That was seen as incredibly dangerous.
Because it could spook the hardliners in the military and trigger a violent crackdown that ruins the whole delicate compromise, right?
Exactly. Furthermore, a core tenet of that older model was the absolute inviolability of the economic system. The prevailing wisdom was that you cannot fundamentally renegotiate capitalism and introduce a fledgling democracy at the exact same time.
The cognitive and institutional load is just too heavy.
Right. Property rights must remain secure to reassure the outgoing elites that they won't lose their fortunes.
Okay, so that is the X-ray machine the world brought to the post-communist transitions in 1989. And the reality of the fourth wave completely shattered the lens.
Completely.
Because nothing that happened in Eastern Europe fit that old model. In 1989, the transitions were lightning fast. They were highly confrontational.
And mass mobilization.
Yeah. The citizens weren't a threat to the transition. They were the engine of the transition. We are talking about millions of people in the streets tearing down physical and ideological walls.
It was a total paradigm shift. The old transitology theories were completely inadequate.
They just didn't work.
No, they didn't. And when you look at the macro analysis of this era, you find the missing variable that explains why this fourth wave was so fundamentally different from Latin America or Southern Europe.
And what is that?
That missing variable is a massive tectonic shift in the international system. Michael McFaul really hammers this home.
Let's really dig into this, because I think this is where the geopolitical math just flips on its head.
So, during the third waves in the 70s and 80s, the entire globe operated under a bipolar Cold War system. The United States and the Soviet Union anchored two entirely different competing world orders.
Right.
And that bipolarity placed strict constraints on what kinds of domestic political transitions were even allowed to happen. But by 1989, that entire global architecture was collapsing.
We were rapidly shifting into a unipolar world anchored by Western liberal democracy.
Yes. And critically, as the Soviet Union imploded, the external safety net for every single autocrat in Eastern Europe simply vanished.
I mean, put yourself in the shoes of a Communist Party boss in East Germany or Poland in 1989. For decades, your ultimate insurance policy was the Red Army.
Yep.
If your citizens got too restive, if the opposition got too strong, you knew Moscow would roll the tanks in to save your regime, just like they did in Hungary in '56 or Prague in '68.
But suddenly the phone rings out.
Moscow is broke, distracted, and structurally incapable of saving you. The tanks aren't coming.
And when that exogenous supplier of power for the status quo disappears, the entire dynamic changes. The local domestic balance of power suddenly becomes the sole determinant of regime survival.
Just whoever is stronger locally wins.
Exactly. If the mobilized citizens and the democratic opposition were stronger, democracy won. If the old communist elites and their security forces were stronger, autocracy consolidated and basically just rebranded itself.
So it was no longer about finding a delicate, pacted stalemate.
No, it was about raw, unmitigated power on the ground.
Which totally changes the concept of democracy without Democrats. I mean, if the third wave in Latin America was like a highly negotiated, tense corporate merger where the outgoing authoritarian CEO gets a golden parachute, he keeps his wealth, he gets amnesty from prosecution,
Right.
then the post-communist fourth wave feels like a brutal, hostile takeover.
A hostile takeover where the winner dictates the new rules entirely. The data emphasizes that these transitions were non-cooperative zero-sum games.
Wow.
It wasn't about finding a win-win compromise to avoid a civil war. It was about total victory. And this zero-sum nature has profound lasting implications for the types of institutions that are subsequently built in these countries.
Because when transitions are non-cooperative, the people writing the new constitution aren't trying to share power.
No, they're building distributional institutions. They skew the rules of the game to permanently favor the side that won.
They lock it in.
Exactly. If the Democratic challengers possessed overwhelming societal power, they imposed liberal democratic institutions, independent courts, free press protections, decentralized power. They locked in their victory structurally.
But the reverse is also true, right?
Oh, definitely. If the authoritarian elites retained the upper hand, perhaps because they had a monopoly on the local economy or a tighter grip on the military, they imposed institutions designed to consolidate a new, modernized dictatorship.
Like super presidencies.
Yes, super presidencies with zero checks and balances. This fundamental zero-sum divergence explains why the post-communist world didn't all move in one direction.
It explains why a country like Poland could become a robust market democracy, while a country like Turkmenistan immediately hardened into a totalitarian personalist dictatorship.
Precisely. The raw power dynamic at the exact moment of transition embeds the DNA of the resulting regime.
And we also have to touch on the economic factor. Because the old model said you couldn't reform the economy and the political system simultaneously. But in the post-communist world, they had no choice.
None at all.
Under the Soviet system, the state owned literally everything. The bakeries, the factories, the mines, the land. You couldn't build a new political system without completely dismantling and privatizing the economic system at the exact same time.
It was a dual transition of unprecedented scale.
Which created a massive structural vulnerability. When you are rewriting the Constitution and auctioning off the entire national economy in the same, 5-year window, the opportunities for corruption, state capture, and the rise of oligarchies are just astronomical.
Absolutely astronomical.
Okay, so if we establish that these transitions were zero-sum, hostile takeovers, and that domestic power dynamics were suddenly the only game in town because the Soviet umbrella was gone, we have to look at how that power actually organized itself.
Right.
How did the idea and the specific strategy of revolution jump across sovereign borders? Because when you look at the timeline, these revolutions didn't happen in a vacuum. They clustered. They moved like a wave.
They did, and this requires us to map out the mechanics of contagion. Valerie Bunce and Sharon Wolchuk provide a fascinating granular breakdown of how democracy actually diffuses across borders.
It isn't just magic.
No, and it isn't just human nature yearning to be free.
Hmm.
It is a highly tactical process broken down into 3 distinct mechanisms. The first is demonstration effects.
Which is essentially about human psychology and the calculation of risk. Right?
Yes, exactly.
Let's say you are a citizen living under a repressive regime. You hate the dictator, but you also know that if you protest, you could lose your job, go to prison, or worse. The risk is incredibly high, and the chance of success seems basically zero.
Right. Until you turn on your television or log on to the internet and see a neighboring population, people who look like you, living in a similar system, successfully protest and force their autocrat to flee.
That visual evidence completely redefines what you perceive as possible in your own country.
It alters the risk-reward calculus overnight. Suddenly, the perceived benefits of protesting seem attainable, and the perceived invincibility of the state is shattered. You've just watched a real-world dress rehearsal of a successful revolution next door.
It breaks the psychological barrier. It proves the dictator bleeds.
Precisely. But, demonstration effects alone aren't enough to sustain a movement. That brings us to the second mechanism of contagion, structural isomorphism.
Okay, let's unpack that term because it sounds incredibly academic, but the concept is actually very intuitive. It basically means cross-national fit.
Yes. Think about it this way. Activists in an importing country don't just blindly copy any revolution they see on TV. If you are an activist in an industrialized Eastern European nation, you aren't going to adopt the guerrilla warfare tactics of a rural agrarian uprising in South America.
The context just doesn't fit.
Right. You look for innovations in countries that share similar structural conditions to your own.
You look for countries with the same institutional flaws, the same demographic makeup, and the same specific type of authoritarian vulnerabilities.
Exactly. You adopt their strategies because you recognize a high degree of structural relevance. You see how they exploited a loophole in their constitution, and you realize you have the exact same loophole in yours.
That makes so much sense. And the third mechanism is what makes this all operational: transnational collaborative networks.
Yes.
This proves that contagion isn't just ideas passively floating on the wind or people getting inspired by the news. This is the physical, deliberate movement of people and resources.
The diffusion of democratic tactics involves the active, physical collaboration of student activists, NGO leaders, political strategists, and election monitors. They literally cross borders.
Wow.
They hold training seminars in neutral countries. They share specific tactical knowledge, like how to avoid tear gas, how to print underground flyers, or how to statistically sample a voting booth. It is a highly organized, deliberate networking of democratic forces.
You know, the analogy that constantly comes to mind when looking at this data is open source software development.
Oh, that's a good one.
It really captures the essence of this collaboration. It's not just blind copying, it's local actors downloading a revolutionary source code from a neighbor. Let's say the source code is a specific tactic for organizing a massive nonviolent youth movement.
Okay.
They download it, and then they have to debug it for their specific country. They adapt the branding to their local language, they tweak the messaging to fit their local political grievances, and they figure out how to bypass their specific state internet filters. And then, and this is the crucial part, once they run the program successfully and oust their dictator, they share the updates, the new patches, and the lessons learned back to the regional network for the next country to use.
That is a phenomenal way to visualize it. And the specific, highly refined source code that was being downloaded and patched across the post-communist world in the late 90s and early 2000s was what researchers call the electoral model.
This is wild to me. The strategy wasn't to boycott a rigged election. The strategy was to use the rigged election as the weapon itself.
The electoral model is the strategy of using flawed, semi-competitive elections not as a rubber stamp for the dictator's legitimacy, but as the exact catalyst required for a democratic breakthrough.
And the lineage of this specific source code is fascinating. If you trace the data back, it precedes the fall of the Berlin Wall.
It does.
It goes back to the Philippines in 1986 when Corazon Aquino challenged the dictator Ferdinand Marcos. And it goes to Chile in 1988 with the national plebiscite that finally ousted Augusto Pinochet.
The template they developed was brilliant in its counterintuitiveness. The logic was, participate in the rigged election. Mobilize voters as if it were a real democratic contest. Document the inevitable fraud meticulously.
Gather the receipts.
Yes. And then use that undeniable mathematical proof of a stolen election to trigger massive, undeniable public protests that the regime cannot legitimize cracking down on.
Because cracking down on people demanding their actual votes be counted is much harder to justify internationally than cracking down on a generic anti-government riot.
Exactly. That specific template traveled from Southeast Asia and Latin America, was adapted by activists in Slovakia in 1998, heavily refined in Serbia in 2000, and then fully deployed with massive international visibility in Georgia in 2003 and Ukraine in 2004.
The transnational collaborative networks were sharing this specific, highly effective update to the revolutionary source code.
Teaching each other how to catch a dictator red-handed at the ballot box.
Okay, so we've mapped out this grassroots contagion spreading from below citizens and activists sharing the electoral model across borders. But there was also a massive institutional magnet pulling these countries from above.
Yes, there was.
And this is where we have to shift our focus to the European Union. Because while domestic activists were pushing the rock up the hill, the EU was exerting an incredible gravitational pull from the top.
That's a vital piece of the map. You cannot understand the stabilization of Eastern and Central Europe without looking at the gravity model of democratization.
And what does that entail?
The core analytical idea here is that geographic and economic proximity to a massive, wealthy center of democracy significantly accelerates a transitional country's development. The EU acted as a democratic anchor.
But it's crucial to understand that it wasn't just passive gravity.
No, not at all.
The EU wasn't just sitting there being wealthy and hoping its neighbors would emulate it. It was applying highly active strategic leverage.
And the research shows this leverage was built on two intertwined concepts: conditionality and socialization. Let's really drill down into conditionality because the foundational concept here is asymmetric interdependence.
Asymmetric interdependence. That sounds like a mouthful.
It does, but it basically describes a relationship where one side has all the leverage and the other side is desperate.
Okay, that makes sense.
It is the absolute foundation of the EU's transformative power in the 1990s. Asymmetric interdependence means that the post-communist states emerging from the Soviet bloc desperately needed what the EU had.
Right. They needed access to massive consumer markets to rebuild their shattered economies. They needed direct financial assistance.
And they needed the psychological and military security umbrella of integrating into the West.
But the EU didn't strictly need these post-communist states. Sure, it was nice to expand the market, but the economies of France and Germany weren't going to collapse if Slovakia or Romania didn't join,
The balance of need was completely lopsided.
which gave the bureaucrats in Brussels immense negotiating power.
And the EU used that asymmetric power through a strict, unforgiving system of meritocracy. They didn't just model good behavior, they dangled the ultimate prizeful EU membership and completely withheld it until the ruling elites in these candidate countries implemented incredibly painful, politically risky, and irreversible economic and democratic reforms.
The analogy here is clear, right? You
Yeah.
don't get the carrot until you eat your vegetables.
Exactly.
And the vegetables were tough to swallow. The EU was demanding that these countries restructure their entire judiciaries to ensure independence, aggressively prosecute entrenched corruption, guarantee minority rights in highly fractured societies, and radically liberalize their state-controlled markets.
Which is huge. For a post-communist politician, implementing these reforms often meant dismantling the very patronage networks that kept them in power.
To see how powerful this gravity was and what happens when it is missing, the data points us to a specific case study, Bulgaria.
Yes, Bulgaria is fascinating.
The trajectory of Bulgaria's transition provides a perfect two-act play that illustrates the limits of domestic politics without an external anchor. Let's paint the picture of Bulgaria in the 1990s.
Sure.
In the first act of their transition, from 1989 to roughly 1996, you had a paralyzing parity of power. The ex-communists, who rebranded as the Bulgarian Socialist Party, were perfectly balanced against the former dissidents, the Union of Democratic Forces.
Right.
They could agree on the basic rules of holding elections, but they were in a death grip over economic reform.
Because the ex-communists, quite understandably from a self-preservation standpoint, wanted to protect their patronage networks. They wanted to keep state-owned assets in the hands of their allies.
Yeah.
They promoted what they called the socialist third way. It sounds appealing rhetorically. A middle ground between ruthless capitalism and strict communism.
But in reality, what did that mean on the ground? It meant the government was just printing money to prop up failing state-owned factories. It meant avoiding the painful privatization that the EU was demanding.
And that parity, that political gridlock, preventing a decisive break with the Soviet economic model, led to absolute ruin.
By 1996, Bulgaria was facing an economic catastrophe.
Yes, we are talking about severe hyperinflation that wiped out citizens' life savings in weeks, severe bread and fuel shortages in winter, the complete collapse of the banking system. It was a visceral disaster.
So how do you break a gridlock that deep?
The sheer trauma of the 1996-1997 economic crisis broke the parity. The catastrophic failure of the socialist economic policies completely delegitimized the ex-communists in the eyes of the public.
It triggered massive, month-long daily protests across the entire country. Citizens were blockading roads and surrounding the parliament.
And this is exactly where the EU factor transitions from passive gravity to active leverage.
Okay, how so?
The Democratic opposition capitalized on this profound public anger and forged a new, unbreakable national consensus. They framed the narrative perfectly. The only way out of this hyperinflationary nightmare, the only path to national salvation, was radical market reform and securing membership in the European Union,
The EU became the unifying focal point.
a tangible lifeline. This consensus allowed the reformist forces to sweep the subsequent elections and finally force through the painful restructuring that the country had avoided for 7 years. The EU anchor pulled them out of the spiral.
But looking at this map we are drawing, this raises a massive structural question.
What's that?
If EU membership is this incredibly powerful carrot, if it has the gravity to force deeply entrenched elites to reform against their own short-term interests, what happens to the countries that know they are simply too far east to ever get a bite of that carrot?
You are identifying the exact boundary line of the gravity model.
Think about a country like Belarus or Kazakhstan or even Ukraine in the late 90s and early 2000s, where Brussels made it very clear that EU membership was not genuinely on the table anytime in the foreseeable future.
Right.
Does the EU's smart power suddenly evaporate when the distance becomes too great?
It does. Conditionality only functions if the conditioned membership is credible and realistically attainable. Once you move outside the immediate geographic zone of EU integration into the former Soviet Union proper, the leverage of Brussels drops precipitously,
The external anchor vanishes.
and we are plunged right back into the brutal math of the domestic balance of power.
The citizens in these nations realize nobody is coming to save them with an integration treaty. If they want change, they have to force it entirely from the inside out.
Which brings us to the terrain of what political science defines as competitive authoritarianism. This is a crucial concept to map out.
What does that mean exactly?
These are regimes that have learned to maintain the structural facade of democracy. They hold regular elections, they allow opposition parties to exist on paper, there might even be some heavily monitored independent media.
So it looks like a democracy on a surface-level X-ray.
Exactly. But the playing field is heavily structurally skewed. The autocrat utilizes vast state resources, total media monopolies, and selective harassment of donors to ensure that while the opposition can participate, they can never actually win.
But there is a massive inherent risk in the setup for the dictator, right?
Yes, there is.
By holding elections, even completely rigged ones to appease the international community, they are voluntarily providing a structural opening. They are providing a date on the calendar where the public can legally mobilize.
It is inherently unstable.
Yeah.
But it is entirely capable of surviving indefinitely if the opposition doesn't strategically overwhelm the system. And this is exactly where the electoral model we discussed earlier elevates from a theory into an operational art form.
Okay.
To understand how you beat a competitive authoritarian regime, we have to look closely at Slovakia in 1998 against Vladimir Mišar and Serbia in 2000 against Slobodan Milosevic.
Because the popular narrative of these events is that there was just a spontaneous romantic uprising of the people. But the research shows that is a complete myth.
A total myth.
This was meticulous, unglamorous, exhausting mathematical work.
It was logistical warfare. You had highly organized NGOs running massive get-out-the-vote campaigns, like the OK98 campaign in Slovakia or the Rock the Vote campaigns spearheaded by the youth movement Otpor in Serbia.
And they had to do this because the strategy was purely mathematical. Put yourself in the mind of the autocrat. They have built-in margins of fraud.
Right.
Through manipulating voter registration rolls, stuffing ballot boxes in rural areas, or intimidating state workers, they can comfortably steal perhaps 5, 10, maybe 15% of the national vote.
But there is a logistical limit to how much you can steal before the fraud becomes laughably, undeniably obvious even to your own supporters. The opposition strategy in these countries was to force such massive, unprecedented voter turnouts that it physically overwhelmed the autocrats' capacity to steal the election within that hidden margin.
You aim to create a genuine margin of victory so overwhelmingly large, say winning by 25%, that the state's 10% fraud mechanism becomes mathematically irrelevant.
Yes. And if the state panics and tries to steal 25% of the vote to cover the gap, the fraud becomes so clumsy and obvious that it shocks the conscience of the nation.
And when the fraud becomes undeniable fact, that is the exact moment you transition from the ballot box to the streets.
Which brings us to the dramatic breakthroughs of Georgia's Rose Revolution in 2003 and Ukraine's Orange Revolution in 2004.
The analytical data on Georgia and Ukraine reveals that the critical, indispensable tools for these breakthroughs were parallel vote tabulations, PVTs, and independent exit polls.
Yes. We really need to break down the mechanics of a PVT because this is the absolute technical heart of how you prove a stolen election. It sounds like boring statistics, but it is actually the mechanism of a revolution.
How does it work?
A PVT is an independent, highly sophisticated, statistically rigorous method of auditing an election in real time. It requires deploying thousands of trained, nonpartisan citizen monitors to a scientifically representative sample of polling stations across the entire country. These monitors don't just stand outside. They observe the actual physical counting of the paper ballots at the local precinct level.
And then they have to securely transmit those local verified counts back to a central command center.
Often bypassing jammed state communication lines, yeah.
And they have to do this before the government's Central Election Commission has the opportunity to aggregate the numbers and manipulate the final national total behind closed doors.
Exactly. The result is that the opposition can calculate the true, statistically accurate national vote total independent of the state. It provides undeniable mathematical proof.
You can't argue with the math.
You can't. You cannot sustain a massive, freezing, weeks-long protest against a stolen election if the narrative is just your politician's word against the dictator's word. The public will get tired and go home.
You need hard, verified data to say, no, we won 54% to 42%, the government is lying, and here's the verifiable proof.
That data is the fuel that legitimizes the street protests in the eyes of the public and the international community. When Mikhail Saakashvili in Georgia or Viktor Yushchenko in Ukraine stood on a stage and pointed to the PVT data, it wasn't just political rhetoric.
It was empirical fact.
Yes,
Yep.
and the research highlights that this empirical fact is the specific trigger that causes elite defections.
Let's look at the psychology of the regime elites in Georgia during the Rose Revolution. President Edward Shevardnadze knew his popularity was collapsing. In a desperate bid to maintain power, he forged an electoral alliance with Aslan Abashidze, who was a widely reviled, corrupt regional despot in the Adjara region.
Which was a massive miscalculation. It completely alienated the reform-minded urban elites in the capital of Tbilisi.
It demonstrated the absolute hollowness of Shevardnadze's moral and political authority.
So when the protests swelled to hundreds of thousands of people, fueled by the PVT data proving the government had definitively lost the election, the ultimate arbiters of power had to make a choice.
The guys with guns, the military and the state police, had to decide whether to shoot.
And they chose neutrality.
Because the combination of the PVT data and the massive crowds proved the regime had lost its mandate.
The security forces realized that firing on their own peaceful citizens to protect a deeply unpopular leader who had clearly lost an election and allied with a regional warlord was a suicidal move. The regime crumbled because the pillars of coercion refused to act.
Now, we have to address a major point of contention regarding these color revolutions, because we want to make sure we're representing all sides of the discourse here.
Yes, yours.
If you listen to the narratives coming out of Moscow or Minsk today, the official line from Putin or Lukashenko is that these were not domestic uprisings. They claim the Rose and Orange revolutions were CIA-funded, Western-manufactured coups designed to encircle Russia.
The academic analysis we are mapping provides a rigorous, data-driven correction to that narrative. It is entirely impartial. Yes, there was significant U.S. and European financial and technical assistance.
From organizations like the National Democratic Institute, the International Republican Institute, and various European foundations, right?
Yes, they provided grants to civil society groups.
Yeah.
But the research thesis is unequivocal. The West did not import the grievances, and they did not cause the revolutions. The underlying economic stagnation, the visceral unpopularity of the leaders, and the incredible courage of the citizens facing down riot police, that was entirely organically domestic.
The analogy I use to understand this is that the West didn't invent the disease and they didn't supply the cure, they just provided the X-ray machine.
Oh, I like that.
They provided the technical funding for the PVTs, the training manuals for the election monitors, and the grants for independent polling. They provided the mechanisms that allowed domestic actors to empirically expose the fraud that the regime was already committing.
That is precisely the dynamic.
Yeah.
You cannot use Western grants to pay 1 million people to stand in the freezing snow in Kyiv for weeks during the Orange Revolution. You cannot manufacture that level of societal endurance.
Right.
The external assistance simply provided the technical capacity to mathematically prove the regime's illegitimacy, which acted as the catalyst for the genuine domestic outrage to explode.
But reading through these detailed case studies highlights a real tension. Because with hindsight, looking back at Milosevic in Serbia or Shevardnadze in Georgia, these regimes look incredibly brittle. They look like houses of cards just waiting for a stiff breeze.
But the researchers argue vehemently that this is a dangerous historical illusion.
Just how close did these revolutions actually come to failing?
They came exceedingly close. The data emphasizes that these breakthroughs were never inevitable. If the autocrats had been slightly more popular or slightly more ruthless in utilizing their security forces before the crowds got too large, they would have survived.
Wow.
If the oppositions had allowed their egos to get in the way and remained fragmented instead of unifying behind a single presidential candidate, the math of the electoral model would have failed.
So it was really a tightrope walk.
Absolutely. The underlying vulnerability of the regimes was a necessary precondition, but it was the highly strategic, highly coordinated actions of the opposition and civil society that actually pushed them over the precipice.
Which makes for the perfect transition to a case study that completely defies every single thing we just talked
Oh
about.
yeah, this one breaks all rules.
If the entire premise of the electoral model requires a unified opposition, highly trained NGOs, sophisticated PVTs, and a deeply mobilized pro-Western urban middle class, what happens when an authoritarian regime collapses without literally any of those ingredients?
Then you are looking at a structural anomaly. You are looking at the Kyrgyz Tulip Revolution of 2005. The research demands that we use a completely different analytical lens to map this event, because it breaks all the rules of transitology.
Let's set the scene in Kyrgyzstan in 2005. President Askar Akayev is holding parliamentary elections. But the structural prerequisites for a color revolution, the ones we saw in Georgia or Ukraine, are totally absent here. There is no massive liberal middle class in the capital city of Bishkek. There is no grand ideological opposition party offering a Western-oriented alternative. There are hardly any Western-funded NGOs capable of organizing a nationwide statistically rigorous PVT.
And perhaps most surprisingly, when the protests started, there wasn't even an initial intent to overthrow the president.
It was a revolution born not of national democratic ideology, but of localism and clientelism. To understand how the Tulip Revolution happened, you have to map the specific social structure of Kyrgyzstan.
Which is very different from Eastern Europe.
Power, wealth, and loyalty in this society are highly localized. You have powerful, wealthy local elites in the rural provinces who act as patrons. They provide tangible goods to their local communities. They might fund the local mosque, fix the crumbling roads, provide agricultural jobs, or offer charity.
And in return, the local population offers them absolute political loyalty.
When I was reading this section, I found myself mapping it through a feudal lens. Instead of a unified national army of citizens marching on the capital demanding an abstract democratic ideal, this sounds more like a sudden alliance of regional barons marching on the king because the king broke a very specific local economic contract.
That analogy is highly accurate to the data. During the 2005 parliamentary elections, President Akayev fundamentally miscalculated. He heavily manipulated the electoral results not to fight a grand democratic opposition, but to ensure his personal loyalists, including his own children, won lucrative parliamentary seats.
Which pushed out the other elites.
Yes. In doing so, he aggressively and publicly disenfranchised several prominent wealthy local elites in the provinces.
He essentially stole their fiefdoms.
He did. And these elites, deeply aggrieved by the loss of their rightful political spoils and the disrespect from the central government, activated their localized patronage networks. They didn't need a massive NGO campaign. They basically just told their dependent clients and workers, the central government in Bishkek cheated us. Go out to the local square and protest.
So the mobilization didn't start in the capital with students. It started in the rural provinces.
It started in places like Jalalabad and Osh. And because the central state's coercive apparatus, the police and military, was weak, underfunded, and hesitant to use lethal force in the provinces, they couldn't suppress these localized uprisings.
And it snowballed.
Yes. The various regional elites, seeing that the state was paralyzed, eventually confederated. Their isolated provincial protests merged, physically moved to the capital, and the regime simply buckled under the chaotic weight of it all. Akayev fled the country.
But because this revolution completely lacked that unifying democratic ideology or a cohesive leadership structure, the aftermath was incredibly messy, wasn't it? What happens when the dog catches the car, but it's just a pack of rival dogs?
It leads to immediate fragmentation. Because the victors were an ad hoc, temporary coalition of rival regional elites united only by their immediate opposition to Akayev's greed, they turned on each other the moment he was gone.
Right, because there's no glue holding them together.
Exactly. There was no institutionalized national party ready to take the reins and guide a transition. There was no consensus on constitutional reform. It led to intense instability, rampant corruption, and further political turmoil for years.
Wow.
The core analytical takeaway here is that while chaotic mass mobilization can successfully topple an autocrat, you need institutionalized political vehicles and a unified ideology to actually build a stable democracy afterward.
Okay, so we've mapped out how democratic contagion spreads, how the strategic math of the electoral model works, and even how local elites can accidentally trigger a state collapse. But we have to remember the most terrifying reality of this entire laboratory.
Contagion isn't just a tool for Democrats.
No. Autocrats can read the exact same political science manuals. They watch the same news. Which brings us to the regimes that analyze these democratic waves and successfully engineered resistance.
This is the critical phenomenon of authoritarian resilience and preemption. The research provides a robust framework, notably from Luke and Way, for understanding why some autocrats survive the exact same domestic and international pressures that toppled their peers.
The data identifies three fundamental pillars of authoritarian stability. Let's walk through these three pillars because this is essentially the blueprint for the modern dictatorship.
First, you must have institutionalized ruling party strength. A dictator cannot rule alone. A strong, pervasive ruling party binds elites together, manages the distribution of patronage and corruption effectively, and provides a vehicle for mobilizing public support and swiftly punishing defectors.
Second, you must have immense coercive capacity. And that isn't just about having a large army on paper, right?
No, it's about having a well-funded, highly loyal internal police and security apparatus that has the organizational stomach to deploy violence against massive crowds of peaceful protesters to protect the regime. If the security forces hesitate, the regime falls.
And the third pillar.
High state economic control. If the state commands the commanding heights of the economy, the natural resources, the heavy industry, the major banks, it can effectively choke off any independent funding to opposition parties, starve independent media, and ensure everyone's livelihood depends on loyalty to the state.
Let's apply those exact pillars to Russia's trajectory, what the text calls the reverse wave. Because under Vladimir Putin in the 2000s, Russia violently turned away from the chaotic democratic trajectory of the 1990s.
Catherine Stoner-Weiss covers this brilliantly.
And there is a massive paradox to map here. Usually, political scientists associate rising national wealth and a growing middle class with a push for democratization. But in Russia, skyrocketing GDP actually masked the systematic execution of democratic institutions.
It is the ultimate paradox of the petrostate. Skyrocketing global energy prices in the 2000s flooded the Russian state with unprecedented revenue. This allowed Putin to rebuild all three pillars of stability simultaneously.
He used the oil wealth to rebuild a coercive capacity of the security services. He co-opted or crushed powerful regional governors.
And crucially, he consolidated absolute state control over the economy, particularly the energy sector. He systematically neutralized independent television networks, exiled or imprisoned the independent oligarchs who possessed the wealth to fund the opposition, and built a massive dominant ruling party, United Russia.
But the research is very keen to point out a major flaw in this architecture. They attack the myth of the capable authoritarian state.
Yes.
Putin heavily justified the centralization of power to the Russian public by claiming it was the only way to bring order, efficiency, and effective governance after the traumatic chaos of the 1990s.
But a deep dive into the data dismantles that myth of efficiency. The massive proliferation of state control and the brutal silencing of all political opposition hasn't actually solved Russia's profound systemic governance issues. The autocracy is incredibly effective at political control and regime survival, but it is highly inefficient at basic public service provision.
So they can crush a protest, but they can't fix the hospital.
Exactly. Severe public health crises, massive infrastructural decay, deep demographic decline, and pervasive lower-level corruption remain acute. This creates hidden, long-term vulnerabilities for the regime.
Because when you eradicate all democratic feedback mechanisms, your legitimacy rests entirely on your ability to continuously provide economic growth and nationalistic glory. If the oil price drops or a war goes badly, there are no institutional shock absorbers left.
Precisely. And while Russia relied heavily on the brute force of energy wealth, mapping the trajectory of Belarus provides a masterclass in a completely different, highly insidious survival strategy.
Alexander Lukashenko didn't just survive the democratic waves. He proactively engineered a strategy of preemptive authoritarianism.
Preemption is the dark evolution of authoritarian learning. It is the strategy of analyzing the mechanisms of democratic contagion, anticipating the political challenge, and structurally crushing it years before it ever materializes.
The research identifies that Lukashenko utilized three distinct overlapping types of preemption. Walk us through these, because this is how you inoculate a dictatorship.
First, cultural preemption. Lukashenko aggressively manipulated public memory and Soviet nostalgia. He framed a democratic opposition's nationalistic or pro-European messaging not just as a political alternative, but as a dangerous existential threat to Belarusian identity, stability, and peace.
He weaponized their own history against them. He basically said, look at the chaos in Ukraine, look at the poverty in the 90s. I'm the only thing standing between you and the abyss.
Exactly. Second, he utilized institutional preemption. He didn't wait for the opposition to win seats to fight them. He constantly preemptively changed the structural rules of the game.
Always keeping them off balance.
Yes, he manipulated the Constitution to remove term limits, completely subordinated the electoral commissions, and neutered the parliament to ensure the opposition could never gain even a minor institutional foothold.
And the third type is the most visceral, tactical preemption.
Tactical preemption is about dismantling the physical networks of contagion. It means you don't wait for 1 million people to gather in a central square to test the loyalty of your police. You arrest the organizers on trumped-up tax evasion charges when their movement only has 50 people.
You nip it in the bud.
You close down small independent printing presses over fire code violations. You harass and expel nascent foreign NGOs before they can organize a PVT. You systematically eliminate the structural capacity for mobilization.
And the most terrifying part of this map is that Lukashenko isn't doing this in isolation anymore. The data points to the rise of an active authoritarian international.
This is perhaps the most vital geopolitical development of the era. The post-Soviet autocracies didn't just passively watch the Rose and Orange revolutions. They studied them intently. They recognized that a successful democratic revolution in a neighboring state is a direct, contagious threat to their own survival.
So they began actively collaborating.
They share best practices in digital surveillance and crowd control. They draft copycat legislation to label foreign-funded NGOs as foreign agents. They provide mutual diplomatic cover at the UN and financial lifelines to inoculate each other against Western sanctions and democratic contagion.
I have to push back on the long-term viability of this model, though. I mean, think about the sheer energy required for preemption. If your survival requires constantly squashing every minor threat before it emerges, constantly maintaining total control over the media narrative, isolating your economy from global innovation, and funding a massive police state, doesn't that eventually lead to total paranoia and profound economic stagnation?
It's a huge drain on the state.
You cannot foster a modern, dynamic, tech-driven economy in a society where every citizen is terrified of stepping out of line. How long can an authoritarian international realistically hold back the gravity of human development?
That is the essential defining question for the next 50 years of political science. Preemption is incredibly resource-intensive, and it fundamentally hollows out the intellectual and economic core of a society. Right.
The analysis suggests that while these preemptive regimes may appear monolithically stable on an X-ray today, their absolute rigidity makes them deeply brittle in the long term. Because they have destroyed all independent feedback mechanisms, they are structurally blind to their own decay. When the collapse comes, it is rarely gradual. It is usually sudden and catastrophic. So let's step back and synthesize this incredible sprawling map we've drawn today. We started in the ashes of the Cold War, exploring how the removal of the Soviet umbrella made raw domestic power dynamics the ultimate determinant of whether a nation became a democracy or a dictatorship.
We mapped out the profound active optimism driven by the European Union's conditionality, legally pulling Eastern Europe toward market democracy.
We examined the incredibly strategic mathematical triumphs of the electoral model in places like Serbia, Georgia, and Ukraine, where mobilized citizens used the tools of contagion to mathematically prove electoral fraud and force democratic breakthroughs against the odds.
And we explored the structural anomalies, like Kyrgyzstan, where local patronage networks inadvertently triggered a state collapse.
And finally, we confronted the harsh, adaptive reality of authoritarian learning. We looked at the preemptive strategies of Belarus and the petrostate consolidation in Russia, leading to the highly collaborative authoritarian international we see operating today.
Which brings us back to the central, sobering thesis of the entire volume. Democratization is not a linear, inevitable march of history. It is a highly competitive, transnational, and brutal struggle. The very tools of diffusion digital technology, cross-border networking, demonstration effects are now actively utilized by both Democrats seeking to open societies and autocrats seeking to permanently close them.
And this is exactly why this deep intellectual mapping matters so much to you, the listener. Because understanding how these hybrid regimes operate, how they use the structural facade of democracy to maintain autocratic control, is essential for navigating the news you read every single day. We are long past the era of simplistic, inevitable transitions. The X-ray machine is broken.
We are operating in an era of fiercely contested political evolution, where every single democratic gain must be rigorously, continuously defended against highly adaptive, well-funded authoritarian pushback.
Which leaves me with a final, provocative thought for you to ponder long after we finish today. If modern autocrats have successfully cracked the code of the electoral model, if they now know exactly how to preempt NGOs, digitally control the domestic narrative, and share survival strategies globally to permanently inoculate themselves against citizen mobilization, are we currently witnessing the birth of a fifth wave? A wave defined not by the triumphant spread of democracy, but by the technological and strategic perfection of the modern authoritarian state.
It is a sobering, chilling prospect, but an entirely necessary question to ask based on the data we've mapped today.
We started this deep dive talking about the comfort of a simple medical diagnosis. We all want a clear picture of transition, a clean, visible break between dictatorship and democracy. But we've learned that the diagnostic waters of the global political system are permanently, intentionally muddy. The fracture lines are constantly shifting. But by understanding the mechanics of contagion, the active leverage of institutions, and the dark adaptations of autocrats, we can finally start to read the murky scans of global regime change.